I was talking a little bit about this on Discord with our audience, and I was saying that it's my conversion is to 60 frames was exposure therapy. When you're on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 to a degree, certainly PlayStation 4 base, and you're seeing 30 frames over and over again, your eyes, and it's not even literally your eyes, like your whole concept of games, you understand it through that prism. And when you start seeing it differentiated, it comes off as faster, but you start kind of calling those fast games or games that feel faster, but you're still stuck in a 30 frames environment. And so your mind doesn't get to kind of segue over to the new reality. For me, PlayStation 5 has made it so that I'm playing game after game after game after game after game after game after game at 60 frames a second. And so my entire paradigm has shifted, and now I see it. And as I discussed, Evil West a few months ago was the game that really jarred me for the first time, where I said aloud, this looks like fucking shit when I was playing it, not realizing it was in 30 frames. And then I switched and I was like, oh, that was the shift, like the come to Jesus moment. I think this matters because I would beclown any PlayStation 5 first party game that ever dares to come to PlayStation 5 under 60 frames a second, 60 frames a second. And that is the baseline expectation. And I don't think Sony should have any worries, because we have games like Ratchet and Clank, which is a pretty graphically impressive and intensive game running at 60 frames, Horizon Forbidden West running at 60 frames, and God of War Ragnarok running at 60 frames. So I don't see why anything is not going to run at 60 frames. And if you gave me one of those games at 30 frames a second, I'd be really astounded, not because it's necessarily wrong, but because my entire understanding of frame rate has shifted as I've gotten more repeated exposure to 60 frames. So you don't want to go backwards. This is kind of the future that 60 frames purists always wanted.
I cannot go back to 30. I cannot do it. I simply can't. From the second and I was fine with it for a while until I think the Master Chief Collection came out, and I was playing all the games that I used to love at 60 frames. I'm like, oh well, no way. I'm going back. I'm going back at this point. And what blows my mind about this 30 frames per second thing with recent Xbox first party or upcoming Xbox first party is that Redfall and Starfield, I mean, you could argue if they fit into this category or not, but I would argue they do. They're first-person shooters.
Right.
And they're 30 frames.
Redfall especially is a first-person shooter on category.
Redfall especially. But to me, it's like, dude, of all the genres that need 60 frames per second the most, like, this is the one. Like, these are the games that require, I would argue, more than any other game, 60 frames. Maybe fighting games, you could make a case as well. But for me, like, I can't imagine playing a first-person shooter at 30 frames per second on a modern machine. I can't imagine that. And I just don't understand what's going on. Because, I mean, and this isn't impugning the state of the game, by the way. Like, I'm sure Starfield's probably going to be great. I have a lot of faith in Redfall, actually. Like, even though I'm not, like, super into the premise, Arcane is just great in general. So I think the game's going to be great. I think what's there is going to be awesome. But it's embarrassing.
It's Digital Foundry, I think, that wrote some sort of editorial saying 30 frames games are coming back. Like,
that's certainly possible. And I believe that Digital Foundry's argument is that the reason why we had so many 60 FPS standard games so far this generation is because of this really long extended cross-gen period where you have a game like God of War Ragnarok that is basically a PS4 game that they made look real nice and then a higher frame rate on PlayStation 5. Same with Horizon. As great as it looks, that's also a PS4 game that they just made look better on PS5. So a lot of their argument is, as we get into current gen only territory, developers may want to maximize the hardware in a way that puts fidelity over performance, which is certainly possible because we already saw that with Plague Tale kind of doing their 30 FPS, and maybe I think they have 120 hertz mode that does 40 frames or something like that. So We have seen instances of that, but I would argue that that isn't necessarily going to be the case, because I think that if developers have been smart and observing how consumers are reacting to these consoles and for the software on it, that they're seeing that 60 FPS should be an important initiative for current gen only games. And there's two really good examples of that in Dead Space Remake being a PS5, Series X, whatever game only and running at 60 FPS, and Final Fantasy 16, which is going to be it already confirmed has a performance mode and is only on current gen. So it comes down to how developers want to decide how to maximize the hardware resources before them. In the case of Redfall, and this isn't an excuse, but it's me just looking at the situation, trying to glean why this is the case. My best guess is that they are running into a CPU limitation, particularly with multiplayer. So in that case, it doesn't matter if they lower the resolution. If their CPU, if they're
Right.
running into a bottleneck there, then there's other things that they need to optimize. That would make sense to me in that if this game is kind of the more immersive sim, only with multiple players involved, then there is going to be a lot of world interactivity, which would hit the CPU pretty heavily. But it sounds like they, or at least what they're saying, is that they have a path to optimize the game to get to that point. My best hope is that this 2-year period of cross-gen has sent a clear message to developers saying, shift your focus. We don't need the highest fidelity, highest resolution games. We want games that feel better to play. And frame rate is a huge part of that.
I think friend of the show, Jez Corden, wrote a piece that I was reading a little bit of earlier today, where it's just Redfall. It's not Redfall that seems to be the problem for people. It's that Xbox seems to be incapable of doing anything meaningful at all. And it's frustrating. And I mean, from a games perspective. And I think it's becoming frustrating for that group of people. Like, they're becoming very disenchanted. And because people are like, what, maybe that indicates Spider-Man will be this. I'm like, dude, Spider-Man 2 is not going to be anything less than 60. I mean, they'll have a 30 frames high fidelity or a high resolution mode, but Spider-Man 2 is running 60 frames a second. I mean, we all know that they're never going to do that. And the one thing I wanted to underline here is that Sony's silence has been so obnoxious for the last couple of years. We are scratching in our goddamn faces for news. We're going crazy in padded rooms for anything. But you know what the massive advantages of them being quiet is? They get to watch everyone else make all of these mistakes. And then they're just like, oh, we definitely can't do that. I mean, at this point, they're looking at it and saying, I mean, we cannot release a 30 frames first party game under any circumstances. I don't think that was ever a danger of happening, but I think that this underlines that for them. You know, I think that all of these different situations are underlining all these circumstances, regardless of what they are just, that's the beauty of the silence. That's frustrating as a pundit and someone who wants to talk about these things, but they're probably happy as pigs in shit because their console is selling through the roof. The games are selling extraordinarily well. They haven't said a goddamn word about anything. They have this certainly Emmy bait, The Last of Us HBO show, more things on the way. And they're just watching Microsoft walk in the rakes with like what matters most, which are the games.